Tuesday, greetings. How is everyone? How is everyone doing today? It's so great to see you all. Welcome back. And for those of you who might be new to Tuesday group, or anyone on the Zoom who's perhaps new to Tuesday group, every single Tuesday, excluding the month of December, we get together and we have the opportunity to be in community with one another, whether it's online or in person, and we learn something new. And we strive for education that is relevant to our region, and that's what we're all about. So if you have questions or comments, you can always email tuesdaygroup@gmail.com. You'll reach me. My name is Lacey, and I very much treasure this opportunity to get to know people in the community. So feel free, please, to reach out and make contact. For those of you who are on Zoom, we do have you on the screen up here, just an FYI. We had a community member who tends to attend in person say, hey, I want to know who's on the Zoom. Like, if I like being in person because I get to see someone and say, hi, Barb, like, so nice to see you, it's been a while. Wouldn't it be neat to know who's on Zoom? So maybe I can call them or text them and say, what do you think about that presentation? So something new we're trying here today, but when we get going, we'll minimize the screen and have it be all about the PowerPoint. So as usual, we start with community announcements. Does anyone have a community announcement they would like to share?
That's unusual.
It is unusual. Yeah, okay, you have a question?
Yeah. So on February 16th, my mother will turn 100. Some of you remember seeing her in here. She used to come with me often to Tuesday group. It's harder for her to get here now. And I'm trying to come up with COVID-safe ideas for things to do for her birthday. She's already going to be going dog sledding, so that's going to be pretty awesome. We should all do that for our 100th birthday. But if anybody has any ideas, find me after lunchtime and talk to me. So that's my question. What ideas might somebody have about what to do for a 100th birthday that's COVID safe, doesn't involve crowds of people?
Winter.
In the winter, in Ely. Go someplace warm is not an option. So.
Yes. Great. I'm just going to repeat that for the Zoom crowd here quick in case you can hear me better. We've got our Zoom microphone right here. So we have an audience member who has a mother who's about to turn 100 years old. And so if you have an idea for a social distance appropriate celebration, please let us know and we will forward your ideas on to our friend here. I think it's worth noting that Ely Winter Festival is about to begin, and I personally really appreciate the opportunity to celebrate winter, because if you live in the Northwoods at the end of the road, you have honestly no choice but to celebrate winter if you want to have an enjoyable lived experience for several months out of the year. And the Ely Art Walk is part of the Ely Winter Festival, so please take the opportunity to go up and down the streets of Ely in the main drag and celebrate local artists. Right. Well, I'm going to give the microphone over to Barb Jones, who's going to introduce our special guest speaker for today.
Hi, everyone. We were lucky to have Steve come to our climate change group just before this, so thank you for that. Steve is a professor at Western Washington University. Before that, he was in Idaho and in West Virginia, where he established a land trust, a functioning land trust. He graduated at the University of Oregon, PhD at Ohio State. And he's published a lot on the topic that he's talking about today, but also on other issues like biofuel for jet planes, extreme sports, and ecological concerns in various diverse places, including China, Costa Rica, and Ukraine. He's originally from Minnesota, and he's spending 18 months here in Ely. We hope that the attractions of the place are going to mean that maybe he'll actually settle here in Ely in the not too distant future. He's an outdoor active person. He bikes and canoes, which I think he calls pedaling and paddling, and cross-country skis. He met Elton on a cross-country ski at Hidden Valley. Elton apologizes for not being here and doing the introduction himself because the ski meet, which was scheduled for Thursday, has been moved to today because Thursday is going to be rather on the cold side. And Elton is a fixture at these ski meets. They can't happen without him. So Steve's work focused on protective area policy and management, land trusts, conservation easements, and environmental resource management. So he's come to the right place here. He's going to talk about creating a carbon conservation trust movement. Steve.
Thank you, Barb. Okay, can you hear me? Sound all right? Thanks, Barb and Lacey. The pedal paddle thing that Barb referred to was how I got to Ely this summer. So I was the dean of the College of the Environment at Western Washington University for 10 years. Before that, like she said, I was at the University of Idaho in the forestry school there, and I was at West Virginia University in the forestry school. But I've just spent 10 years at Western as the dean. And with COVID, 10 years is a long time to be a dean, and I was done. And I wanted to do something different. I had a sabbatical coming. So what I did was I bought a trailer from a German company for my bike, and I put my solo canoe on the trailer, and I dragged that solo canoe over the Continental Divide and down to the Missouri River near Helena, and then I paddled the Missouri River all the way to the Sacagawea Reservoir, and then I got back on my bike and I paddled the rest of the way through to Ely. So that's how I got here. It was kind of my low carbon, decarbonized way to travel, the way to be a tourist, the way to recreate without a lot of carbon emissions from flying in airplanes and all that kind of thing. So I'm trying to kind of learn how the future might be different and how I can kind of practice that kind of stuff myself. Like Barb said, I'm from Minnesota originally. I grew up in North Minneapolis area, and but I moved away to college when I was 18. But I always came back here to work. I've worked up in the Ely area ever since I was 14, 15 years old. And it's been a long time since I had a chance to kind of get back. And this sabbatical is my time for doing that. So I'm hanging out here, renting a place on Fall Lake for the winter, for the year, and working on the kinds of topics I'll be talking with you today about. So I call this talk Creating a Carbon Conservation Trust Movement. It's based on the paper that you can see right there. You just go to Medium, Steve-Hollenhorst at medium.com / and you can see that paper. There's also a blog there about the summer trip if you're interested in that kind of low carbon adventure travel too. You can kind of see it, some stuff about that too. I wrote this paper with a partner, Howard Sharfstein, and together we're now trying to sort of implement some of the ideas in for this movement, which I'll talk about later today. But it's based on this basic proposition. And that proposition I want you to think about is this idea that we need to rethink our attitude and our relationship with carbon. And we have to get beyond seeing carbon as this negative, scary thing, right? Carbon emissions, right? Something that we need to control and manage and stop, right? And all the kind of terrible things that go with what we understand as carbon, and go beyond that to see it as an inheritance, our carbon inheritance, and as something that has a positive, right? And that a positive is that it's an immense climate regulator that controls the atmospheric carbon levels in our planetary life support system, right? And thus, it's this cool thing, much like other conservation values that we love, that is deserving of our attention, of our protection, and our conservation. Okay, so I want to get us to expand our focus beyond using the police powers of the state to prohibit carbon emissions, which requires political consensus and very sophisticated technology, and instead look at, or beyond that, to look at what we can do to safeguard these precious carbon reserves in place, which we can start doing today, even if we don't have a political consensus. Okay, so the alternate title of this talk could have been, see if it's working, it's not. So there must have been something with the chat that affected it. You guys?
It should work now.
So channeling Dr. Strangelove, the other topic for this talk could have been how to stop worrying and love carbon, or maybe even more provocatively, buy carbon now. Buy carbon now. Okay, so I hope that's got your attention. Okay, so what's the problem? Well, basically, climate change results from humans and human activity moving vast quantities of carbon in the form of greenhouse gases from the lithosphere. What's the lithosphere? Right now?
The crust of the
It's the crust of the earth, right? Moving it from the lithosphere and from the biosphere, living organisms, into the atmosphere and the hydrosphere. The atmosphere, the air, the hydrosphere could be the oceans, right? And that carbon is in the form of these ancient plants that have been accumulating over the past 250 million years and form this massive carbon reserve that makes life on this earth habitable. Without all that carbon down in that fossil reserve, it would be in the atmosphere and in the oceans, and life would not be habitable, right? So it's this immense sort of ecosystem service that's functioning in place, right? It serves a function. It makes this place livable, right? Well, we know what the problem is. The problem is that we're emitting 59% more carbon into the atmosphere from these lithospheric and biospheric reserves than the Earth is able to reabsorb back out of that system every year. Every year, year after year, 59% goes out into the atmosphere more than we're able to retain. And we know what we need to do. We know that we need to pull down those emissions that we're putting out in the atmosphere every year. And we know that we need to increase the capacity of the land to reabsorb those carbon emissions back out of the atmosphere, right? But the challenge is, how do you do it? And how do you achieve the political consensus needed to exercise the police power of the state to do that, right? So we know we could do this if we regulated it and taxed it, but we don't have the political sort of ethos in this country to do that. We just don't. And you know, if it were up to me, I would say yes, this is an existential crisis that we're all facing, and we need to do these things. But I'm also a realist, and I know that politically that's not where we are as a country. And for that reason, we need to work at other ways, possibly getting the work happening at the scale needed to actually fix this imbalance. Okay, now, so I started to think about this, and I started thinking, you know, we've been here before. And there was this guy named William H. White, who back in the 50s, he realized the same thing when it came to another problem that society was facing at the time, and that problem was urban sprawl, right? And he saw this William H. White was an interesting guy. He wrote this book called The Organization Man. It was kind of one of those early trend books about what was happening in society and that kind of stuff. But he was really an urbanist, and he was studying urban form and the sort of the evolution of urban environments, right? And he saw this sprawl thing happening. And what he did is he wrote this article for Life magazine, a plan to save the vanishing U.S. countryside, right? And he came to this realization that, you know what, we are not going to regulate our way out of this problem. There's no way that we have the political consensus in this country to say, no, you're not going to develop that land. Nor did we have the political will to confiscate that land, right, for public ownership to preserve it that way. So he said, what else can we do? What other tools might be out there that are available to us that are politically sort of tenable, that we could bring people together around? And what he arrived at was this idea of property rights. Okay, now here's kind of in a nutshell what White kind of came up with and what his sort of contribution to modern conservation is. Okay, so he saw the land that out there as this sort of bundle of rights that people own property, right? And in that property, if you look at that, what it is, it's you own a bunch of different things when you own that property. Okay, so let's say you have a piece of land and you have rights to that land. Let's talk about that for example. Give me an example of one of the rights or values that comes with owning that land. What do you get to do with it?
Hunting.
You can hunt on it. Right. What else comes with owning that land?
You can sell it.
You can sell it.
Log it.
You can log it.
Mineral rights.
No trespassing.
You can control access to it. You can decide who comes on it, who doesn't come on. Right. What else? You can subdivide it. Right. You can sell pieces. These are all the things that constitute sort of that bundle of rights. And this is really at the core of a lot of our sort of American ethos of how this works, this powerful notion of private property that is part of the way Americans think, right? You know, and it's not universal. There are parts of the world where this concept of private property ownership is not known. If you go to Russia and you go to China, individuals do not own property. The property belongs to the state, right? You own the house maybe on that property and have sort of a temporary sort of right to occupy that property, but the property itself does not belong to you. So this is kind of a unique idea to this country, a very powerful idea. So here's what White had in mind. He thought, what if we use legal instruments that we already have and markets to untie that bundle of rights and transfer the conservation values of property ownership to a third party, either a nonprofit group or to a government entity, right? So for instance, what if we took out the subdivision rights to the property, but the rest of the property stayed with the property owner? What if we took out the development rights to the property, but the property still remained, the ownership of the property remained with the private landowner, and we transferred those conservation values to another party whose job was to conserve those for the benefit of the public, right? And that entity could either be government or a nonprofit group. So White was quite, if you think about this idea, the tool that White came up with was what we know today as a conservation easement, right? And these are covenants attached to private land that restrict what can happen on those lands because those restrictions and those rights have been transferred to another entity whose job is then to protect those in perpetuity, right? And that's called a conservation easement. There's about 60 million acres today in this country under conservation easement. That's almost one in every 5 acres of private land. Think about this for a minute. 1 out of every 5 acres of privately owned land in this country is restricted by a conservation easement. That's amazing. That's amazing success, right? And here's a little map of where those conservation easements are. Most of them are on the fringe of cities where White thought they would be. And what they've done is they've made sure that that open space on the fringe of cities will be open space forever. But they're not all there. So for instance, if you look at Minnesota, it's quite unique. You see this band from the Red River Valley all the way down through the Minnesota River Valley. And what do you think those conservation easements, where are they and what are they protecting?
I'm gonna guess wetlands.
They're wetlands protecting migratory fowl habitat, right? And that's amazing, all that land that's in that. And then there's a little square of land way up north of the Boys Fort Reservation that also is in the system. See that big old square up north? It's north of the reservation there. I have no idea how that square got there, but that's clearly timberland that has been somehow protected by conservation easement. So 1 out of 5 acres in this country, that's about equivalent to the size of the state of Idaho, if you think about it. So that's a lot of land. Okay, so what if, you caught up here, what if we applied this idea to carbon? And what if we looked at carbon as another stick in this bundle? Now, what we do if we did this, we'd be recognizing that all the carbon that's in the lithosphere, the pedosphere, the soil, and the biosphere in plants, all of that carbon is owned by somebody. Somebody owns all that fossil energy that's in the ground. Somebody owns all the carbon that's in the trees and plants on people's property. And someone owns all that carbon that's in the soil below the surface of the property that people own. And what if we looked at that carbon as a conservation value that we could be negotiating with private landowners on conserving? Okay. Now, to do this, we can use 2 types of covenants, and these are voluntarily engaged covenants with private landowners to do this work. One of them is called a restrictive covenant, and this is the most common easement that's used in private land conservation, right? And what that does is it keeps a landowner from doing something, restricts a landowner from doing something, says what you can't do. But it doesn't require you to do something. It just says what you can't do. For instance, you can't subdivide, right? You can still play on it, recreate on it, build a road on it, build a house on it, but you can't subdivide it. That would be an example of a restrictive covenant. But we could also work with landowners to incentivize them to capture more carbon on their property. So let's say we have a treeless piece of property now. What if we wrote an affirmative covenants with landowners to encourage them to plant trees on their property and accumulate carbon over time? So in essence, become carbon farmers or carbon foresters, basically. And to look at carbon as another commodity that they can produce on their property for revenue. That's the basic idea. And then lastly, building on this whole idea of voluntary association that we have in this country, what if we created nonprofit organizations in local communities and bioregions that were out and meeting with landowners and carbon asset owners in their communities and working with them on setting up these kinds of deals and creating this kind of economic opportunity for these landowners? Okay, so now here's how the system would work. I call this the Carbon Conservation Trust model. So, and this is how you basically monetize the carbon on your property. So this is a theoretical approach to how that would happen. Okay, so the first step is for somebody to buy the carbon asset from the carbon asset owner, the property owner, right? And that would be in the form of a carbon conservation easement, which is basically a non-possessory interest in the property, just like a conservation easement. It could be restrictive or affirmative. And that would be something that's negotiated with that landowner and figured out what their interests are in terms of carbon conservation and what the interests of this nonprofit group are that wants to acquire those carbon rights. The next step is then the stewardship of those carbon assets long-term. So carbon conservation easements would be held by these nonprofit organizations on behalf of the public. They would monitor them and steward them into the future and make sure that they are not exploited, that they remain in place. The next step then is called valorization. Okay, valorization is an interesting word. Are there any chemical engineers in the audience who know what valorization is? The word valor is in there. Okay, so in chemical engineering, to valorize something is to take something that is an externality that is a problem and turn it into having value. So think of waste coming out of a municipal sewage waste facility, right? That's an externality. That's a problem society has to do with it, right? To valorize it is to turn it into a nutrient for mulch, for instance, and to be able to sell it. So that's the valorization process. So it's a chemical sort of end product and that industry has to deal with, and trying to find a way to monetize and turn that thing in, not from being an externality and a cost, but being an additional product to sell. Okay, so then you valorize the carbon that's being protected here. And the way you do that is to verify one of two things. Either verify that there's going to be emissions that are not going to happen as a result of this deal, or that additional carbon is going to be collected as a result of the agreement, right? And in both cases, that would result in a carbon credit, a per ton carbon credit that is created as once the avoided conversion or the additionality has been approved. Now, there are these groups out there that's what they do. They already exist. They're not, of course, to the size we need them to be, but basically they are the ones who register this work and verify that the carbon emission reductions are happening. The next step is that creates an emission credit, 1 credit per ton of carbon equivalent produced. And then that is monetizable because that can be sold. It can, basically is a form of a sort of a digital currency. And then the last step in the process is to sell or trade or retire that credit. Okay, and then a market is created for these things. All right, how do we make this kind of thing happen? If you think about it, it's this is a massive process that would have to happen, much like, think of the infrastructure it takes to run a fossil fuel industry or how it takes to run an ag industry. So we have to stand up the same kind of infrastructure to create a market for the commodity of carbon. All right, so here's what we think that kind of system would look like. Okay, so it's kind of, think of it as a on one end, you have the carbon asset owner. On the other hand, you have the carbon asset buyer. And then you got this sort of black box in the middle. That's where all the mechanisms that are happening to create the credit on the carbon asset holder side and get that turned into something that the carbon asset buyer can purchase, can acquire. And we think these are the pieces of that. The first thing is going to be this system of nonprofit carbon trusts scattered around the region. Now, remember what I said, there are 1,600 land trusts around this country that have protected about 60 million acres of land. What if we created an equivalent version of that for carbon, with thousands of carbon trusts working in local landscapes with landowners about increasing the carbon potential and reducing the carbon emissions on their property? Their job would be to do these carbon easement acquisitions, to monitor and make sure there's compliance with that with the landowner, and if they have to enforce their property right, the carbon they have acquired from that landowner through the courts. Okay. The next thing is there's going to have to be a workforce there. So in the fossil fuel industry, there are these folks that, it's a very old-fashioned term, I can't believe it hasn't been changed, called landmen. And what these landmen do is go across the Texas and Oklahoma landscape, and they basically buy and trade fossil fuels. They meet with landowners, whoever owns fossil fuels, and they try to buy those fossil fuels from them so that their company or whoever they work for can develop them. Well, we think there needs to be a parallel version of carbon protectors out there on the landscape that will be essentially working with carbon asset owners to acquire those assets. They may work as an agent for the landowner and help advise them on how to do it. They may work for a carbon trust, or they may be an independent broker who kind of sets up deals between carbon trusts and carbon asset owners to make it work. And then lastly, we think there will be an overarching organization over all this thing that we call the Carbon Conservancy. So kind of the equivalent of the Nature Conservancy for carbon. So instead of protecting biodiversity like the Nature Conservancy does, this organization's goal would be on carbon. All right, they do the standard setting for the industry, the governance, how it works. They'd be the advocates in Congress, making sure that policies were in place to make sure the whole system works smoothly. They're the ones that would help make sure the markets are in place, and of course, doing the education and training to make for the workforce that works in the carbon conservation world. Yeah, so those are all the pieces of the black box that would need to be in place to connect the carbon asset owner with these carbon asset buyers. Okay, now what's the business model? How do you actually turn this thing into money and create a marketplace for the whole thing? Okay, so walk through this with me. I'm going to show you the whole supply chain here, and you're going to see these connectors that connect the thing together. And what those connectors are, I'll tell you in advance, are let's call them one second here. Those are blockchain nodes and smart contracts. So as I talk about this, keep in mind that there will be a blockchain node and a smart contract that links each of these sort of steps in the process together. Okay, so step one, we have a carbon asset owner. This could be a person that owns some former forest land that's now grassland, former ag land that's sitting fallow. It could be ag land. It could be fossil fuels. It could be wetlands, grasslands, prairie, all these kinds of land, anywhere where carbon emissions could be reduced or carbon sequestration could be increased through good management. Okay, so we have that carbon asset owner. What we do then is the carbon trust would buy or somehow acquire carbon interests from those carbon asset holders, right? That's the first step. And remember, there's a blockchain node there and a smart contract. So the same kind of blockchain technology that gives Bitcoin its value or an NFT its value is the same kind of concept here. All right. Then there would be the third-party valorization of the credits created. And we suggest that there are groups out there doing that kind of work now. And the Carbon Conservancy then would acquire those assets that the individual carbon trust created, and there would be a fee attached to that to make it worthwhile for the carbon trust to do that work with the conservancy. Then the Carbon Conservancy would bundle these together and sell them to companies that need to acquire carbon offsets. So I'll give you an example of one of those companies. Microsoft, about a year ago, made a commitment to offset all of the carbon they have ever produced since the company was founded in 1974. They want to be not only a current carbon neutral company, they want to be a company that's went back through their entire life history and offset all the carbon that they've ever emitted, right? So we have those kind of voluntary buyers are out there that are looking for those carbon assets from those landowners. All right, then what the land trust would do would scale this up. They bundle together a bunch of different carbon asset holders into a big deal that is worth it to then Carbon Conservancy in order to get the scale there worthwhile to some of these large companies. So if you think of an airline that needs to offset all its emissions, right? For it to do that, it's not going to work with an individual landowner. It has to work with a bundle of assets that have been created through the whole supply chain, okay? And then there will be many, many thousands of companies out there that need to acquire these assets. So that's the way the whole business model works. Each one of those arrows there is a blockchain node and a smart contract that verifies the carbon credits that are created and passed through the system. Now, there's some checks and balances that have to happen in this whole thing too. And there's a role for philanthropy. So there are companies out there, philanthropies out there who want to work in this climate space. Many of them are investing in crazy technologies and advocacy work to try to get government to impose regulation and do that thing. That's fine. But we think that some climate philanthropy could actually just be pointed toward buying carbon, right? If people want to make a difference and create climate action today, we could aim our climate philanthropy toward acquiring carbon credits from those carbon asset holders, okay? I'm not saying all climate philanthropy, but for people who want to achieve action now and where regulation is not something that fits with them politically, or they don't think it's very practical, this is a different way to engage that kind of money. Then there will be the checks and balances. So this overarching national organization then will make sure that the work of the carbon trusts is actually verified, good, solid carbon conservation work. And those carbon trusts will be verifying and making sure that what's happening on the land with these carbon asset holders is actually occurring. And by doing that, they have to be willing to enforce their rights. So just like if I'm a land trust and I have a development easement on a piece of property that I have purchased from a landowner, I have to be willing to go back every year, make sure that landowner isn't developing the property. And if they do, I have to be willing to go to court to defend my property right, my conservation right to that property that I have acquired from that landowner. The same is the case with carbon. And if we do that, then these carbon buyers will know that we really are creating additionality here, that we really are sequestering more carbon or avoiding future emissions. And that's the business model for the whole system. Like I said, each one of those steps is a blockchain node and a smart contract. Okay, now let's talk locally about how this might work, depending on the kind of bioregion people live in. Okay, so we're up here in northern Minnesota. There's not a lot of farms here, and there's like no fossil fuels. There's no oil or gas here, right? So we're not going to work in that kind of carbon space. But what do we have here? Well, we have trees, and we have private land, and we have wetlands, right? And trees and wetlands, forests and wetlands are huge carbon sequestration machines, right? So we can work with private landowners in this area to incentivize them by creating a carbon commodity for them to get in the business of growing carbon on their property, all right? So in areas like where we are right now, those are the kinds of landowners and those are the kind of carbon assets we'd be conserving and protecting. But it'd be different in other places. So as you get into southern Minnesota, where agriculture is more the norm that you see across the landscape, what we're talking about there is changing agricultural practices so that the soil captures more carbon, right? So we're talking about more deep-rooted plants, possibly a shift to different commodities, possibly being even a shift away from animal-based agriculture toward plant-based agriculture. We know how we know the emissions that come from animal-based agriculture. Depending on what landowners are interested in doing, we see those kinds of shifts in the behavior of those farm owners. And remember, we're not doing it through regulation. We're not doing it where we're saying you have to do this. We're doing this by creating a commodity for carbon and that they can get in the business of carbon farming. Okay, and then in parts of the earth where the carbon is in fossil fuels, like Texas and Oklahoma, the Colorado front in Colorado, where there's lots of natural gas. Here we'd be talking about protecting fossil fuel carbon, and I'll talk about how that will work in a minute. Okay, so let's look at some of those landscapes and see what kind of work might be happening there. And let's start with the hardest one. And the hardest one is going to be fossil fuels. It's going to be oil and gas and acquiring these rights from oil companies. and gas companies, right? But there's a process here, and that process would be very similar to if we were an oil company going out and wanting to acquire these assets. But now we're going to do it, instead of to develop those assets, we're going to do them on behalf of protecting the Earth's climate by keeping those fossil fuels in place. And there's a basic valorization process there, but there's two huge challenges that we face here. And those two challenges are state laws that relate to the rule of capture and compulsory pooling. And what this means is I can own oil in a certain place in Oklahoma or Texas, and I can say, I'm not going to drill for that oil. I'm not going to do that. But if my neighbor does, they have a right to drill for my oil. All they have to do is have a long enough straw, right, to get my oil. And what they have to do then is pay me the royalties for the oil they took off of my property minus the development costs. Okay, so there's a lot of laws there's a lot of policies and laws in oil and gas makes this very difficult, but this is going to change over time so that people can acquire fossil fuel assets in the future and then ensure that they stay in the ground. But changes to these rule of capture and compulsory pooling laws will have to happen. If you want to see a movie that describes compulsory pooling and rule of capture, it's the movie with Daniel Day-Lewis called There Will Be Blood. Remember it? And watch the scene where he murders the guy in the bowling alley. And it's all about compulsory pooling and the rule of capture. That's what that scene's all about. In fact, the whole movie's about that rule right there. Okay, now let's talk about one that's already happening, and that's growing trees. This is the area of carbon exchange that's already the most worked out. This is where the math is pretty worked out. We know how much carbon will accumulate in a tree and how many trees can accumulate on an acre of land, and we're turning those into carbon credits now. Okay, so what we need to do in this whole area is we need to scale it up and do it on more parts of the landscape. There's also a version of this, and that is biochar production, right? So especially in all these fuel reduction projects where we're stacking fuel up in the woods and slash piles and burning it, what if instead of burning this stuff in a slash pile, we burned it in a low oxygen pyrolysis process and locked that carbon up in biochar, where it will stay, it's stable and will stay in that form for hundreds and even thousands of years, as opposed to emitting it in a slash pile fire. So these are kind of the changes to forest management behavior that we think we can see in forest landowners in the future, if they can realize carbon credits from doing it. And of course, agriculture is another huge thing. And this is all about changing the behavior of farmers so that they're not carbon emitters anymore, but they're carbon farmers, carbon collectors, right? And creating a whole commodity industry for farmers to get in the business of. And really, this is a process of shifting agriculture in ways that would result in more carbon protected. Grasslands is another huge area, not very worked out yet. The math is still kind of and the methods are being worked out here. And that's all because it's so variable. In some places where there's lots of water, grasslands will produce a lot of carbon. But where water is a limitation and where heat is a limitation, well, the production is a lot lower. So it's very dependent on the site. Wetlands are huge accumulators of a natural climate solution for accumulating carbon. And we're now just working out the valorization here for wetlands too. And finally, this whole area of buildings. And to me, this is really exciting about what we could do with urban landowners about changing their behavior and change their buildings from being carbon emitters to actually being carbon sinks, right? And the one area you really see this is in the whole area of mass timber and the use of mass timber, big beams and things, instead of concrete and steel in the building of commercial buildings, right? And in the future, these buildings could be carbon sinks rather than carbon emitters, right? And how could we use covenants and agreements with these property owners so that when they do their development, they're turning their projects into carbon positive collecting projects as opposed to carbon negative emitting projects. All right, so there's a couple ways we could see if we're successful here as this movement takes off. The first, of course, is hopefully emissions are reduced as a result of doing this work with landowners, and more carbon sequestration is happening on the landscape because we've shifted landowner behavior to using photosynthesis to collect more carbon, right? We'll know this worked if we create robust, durable markets for the carbon that's created, and we'll know it worked if there's a new workforce out there working in the whole industry. Now, what am I personally doing to kind of make this happen? So to put my money where my mouth is, with my partner, Howard, we have created what we call the Kulshan Carbon Trust. This is a nonprofit carbon conservation group in Whatcom and Skagit County, Washington, where I officially live. This is the upper northwest corner of Washington State on the border with British Columbia. And it's a very wet, lush area with berries is the main agricultural crop, and Doug fir forests, right? So we've created the world's first carbon trust to work in those two counties, to work with the landowners in those counties around these natural climate solutions. So that's what we're doing to kind of put our money where our mouth is there. And one of the projects we're working on is with a group called the Regen Registry. I told you there's these third-party verification groups. And we're working with them to create a whole methodology for calculating the carbon credits that come from biochar production. So we're working with commercial timber harvesting companies to produce biochar from their slash piles instead of burning their slash piles.
Biochar is charcoal.
Charcoal. Yep. Yep. All right. Last slide then. If this idea looks interesting, I just have a few ideas how you could possibly get involved. The first one is start your own carbon trust in the landscape where you live and start working on carbon protection and carbon conservation. The second one is work with us to connect with the climate philanthropy world to stand up this national organization that we're calling the Carbon Conservancy. We have some contacts there, we're working on that, but hey, we're always working to build that network larger. Next, contribute your professional expertise. Maybe it's on finance, maybe it's legal, land use law, fundraising expertise, all these kinds of things. Well, we're always looking for more people who are have skills in those areas. And lastly, help us put together a proof of concept. And what we have to do here is recruit and identify the first socially conscious businesses who will buy the credits that are produced by these natural climate solutions. And we got to then hook them up with the first carbon sellers, the first landowners who want to enter into these relationships where they sell their carbon credits or donate those carbon credits. And there's some reasons why we think that might be a good strategy for some landowners right out of the blocks here. Okay, so that's my talk. We still have 10 minutes left. I want to be conscious of there be people being on Zoom too, and I'm happy to answer questions either here in the audience or to the Zoom folks. Well, let's talk about minerals first. And I think it's really interesting for the upper Midwest because for the most part, the mineral estates we have are not fossil fuel minerals. I mean, I know there's a little bit of natural gas production, southern Iowa, southern Illinois, there's some coal, but for the most part, especially in Minnesota, fossil fuel conservation is not something that for the most part we have to worry about. But what we do have is we have the wetlands that you're talking about. So for me, the natural climate solution suite in Minnesota for the most part is farmlands, forest lands, and wetlands, right? And there's conservation happening in all three of those areas right now, but it is not carbon conscious conservation that's going on. And what I think could happen here is this could augment and bring a new angle and a new revenue stream into those programs instead of beyond the current, say, Ducks Unlimited, waterfowl habitat type dollars that are currently being harnessed to do this work. And then I would say this. Yes, the police powers of the state to regulate buffers is always going to be an issue, but it's incredibly grating to those private landowners.
Incredibly what?
Grating. They hate those regulations overall, right? And instead, what if we looked at an approach to extending that work where we're acquiring those rights as opposed to regulating them for those landowners? So essentially, we're creating a new revenue stream for them through conservation as opposed to regulating out their ability to, for instance, drain those wetlands. We're already doing it. You saw that swath of easements that go through the migratory waterfowl areas of Minnesota in those wetlands there. We have a great start. And all I'm saying is now let's bring carbon into the picture and all the dollars that could come with that to expand that kind of work. Yeah. So could we focus that answer mostly on corporations and companies and why they would buy the credit? Because that's actually where most of the emissions are occurring. So I think if we could focus there, that's the way I would explain it. So here's what's going on. There are some mandatory markets, California, Oregon, Washington, where these companies have to buy carbon credits. They have to offset the emissions that they're creating through their operations with these carbon purchases, right? And they have to calculate that all out, and they're required by the laws in their states to do it. But most states aren't going to do that. In most states, it's a voluntary market. But you know what? Companies, thousands of companies are making this commitment. And why would they do that? I think you got at the heart of it. Why would Home Depot, of all places, decide that they're going to offset their emissions? Well, the reason they're going to do it is because their customers want them to. And I bring up Home Depot because it's a very conservative company, but they have bought into the forest certification process because they know that their customers want to know that the timber they buy was harvested in a sustainable manner, right? And so it's a business proposition to these companies where if they look like they're green, and they really are, and they're doing it in legitimate ways, it'll reflect in their sales. So I think for now, it's mostly going to be those kind of voluntary markets, companies like Home Depot and Microsoft that make these commitments. But then there will also be places in huge markets like California where it'll be required. So yeah, agriculture is huge. Food is the third biggest, food production is the third biggest source of climate emissions worldwide. And it's a huge part of what's going on in the United States. And it's not only because it takes a lot of diesel fuel, a lot of fossil fuel to produce this food, but it's also a system that has reduced the carbon capture capacity of the land where this agriculture is occurring. So it's this twofold problem, right? And you're right, for the most part, I'd say it's a fair statement to say that the American ag industry has fought any regulations around these things in any way. But you know what? In Washington, D.C., they're around the table right now as these policy conversations around carbon markets and carbon credits is emerging. They see this as an additional commodity in the future that farmers can use as a revenue stream. And they just think the writing's on the wall. And so they're there trying to be part of those climate conversations. It's kind of like okay, this is going to happen. How can now we get in there and make sure that it happens in the best way for their industry? And I think what you're going to see is, I think the policies are going to emerge. Clearly, the ag industry is going to help develop those. But in the end, there are going to be carbon markets that we see these large corporate ag interests playing in. Right now, most of the agreements that are happening with forest owners are short-term. As I understand it, they're like 10 to 15-year agreements. And they're not easements as much as they are legal sort of agreements on how the forest is going to be managed for the next term, for that 10 or 15 years, right? And my understanding is that carbon then will be sequestered annually buy that property and produce an annual carbon credit for that landowner. Now, it could be that they sell it all right up front, but in some cases, I think it's being set up so it's actually an annual revenue that will be coming to those owners. I think both are happening. I don't know which.
Purchase over time,
What's that?
purchase over time.
A purchase over time. As I understand it right now, they are not permanent. Nobody's writing permanent in perpetuity conservation easements to make sure that that carbon is sequestered forever. Their term agreements, and I think we'd like to extend that to be permanent. Now, we're not saying there shouldn't be logging on those properties. In fact, as we move toward mass timber construction in this country, and we move, remember, concrete and steel are the most carbon-intensive building materials out there. And if we can shift toward biomaterials, I think that's a good thing. So the types of agreements that I would write would not necessarily restrict all logging. In fact, it would encourage logging that results in durable, final carbon sequestering products from that timber. Yeah.
For the last few years, if you fly somewhere, you're offered the opportunity to buy carbon credits. Those don't come through your system as yet. Where do they come from? And are they real?
Well, there's a lot of them out there, and some of them are pretty good and a lot of them are awful, right? And that's where the whole verification part of this whole thing comes in. And why there is going to have to be some government role in regulating those markets, I think, to make sure they really are real markets, right? Not just some puffy claims, right? But the ones that do work, what you're essentially doing, as I understand it, is that you're offsetting the emissions that come from your flight. What they're basically doing is pooling that together with all the other people who bought their credits. Then they're going to developing world countries, and they're acquiring the property interest in those properties to make sure there's trees that are growing. So I have a lot of problems with that in a lot of ways. I think it's where we're not really facing up to our local sort of responsibility to get involved in. But that's generally how I think, as I understand it, how those systems are working with individuals. Yes.
Seems to me that, this sounds like a great idea. It seems to me there's a lot of other systems that rely on and interconnect. One of them, having lived out west for a long time, is water.
I know.
And the interconnection of water involved with all of this. And I think one of your slides had the education process. I think the education has to be wider as well. On the other hand, you can't get the big picture without understanding some of the smaller pictures and vice versa. So that just seems like a big problem that we could address.
I think you're right. And if I could bring up an example, I think where that's happening right now, and it's with nut-based milk. So there is this huge shift happening in this country right now where we're moving away from animal milk toward nut-based milk. The market is, and almonds being the leader there. Oats, not nut-based, but another kind of milk. But almonds is the real leader. Almonds consume a ton of water. That's almond agriculture, mostly in California and Arizona. And so there's this trade-off there with the use of that water and the requirement of that water to grow those almonds. But when you do the entire life cycle analysis, the amount of water used compared to that for animal-based milk production is low. But it's in a different place that doesn't have it, right? So there are all these really difficult problems that you're exactly right. We have to deal with in a sort of system way as we make these shifts happen. I think this shift from animal-based diet toward plant-based diet, like we're seeing in milk, is going to continue to happen, and it's going to create this sort of what do you call it? What's the word? Buffering sort of effect all across the economy. And right now we're not facing up to it. It's just kind of happening ad hoc. But I'm concerned about the same kind of issues with things like water. Emissions, other air emission problems are another one. We can produce biochar, but when you produce biochar, you're emitting a lot of other gases in the atmosphere at the same time. Yes, maybe less than if it burned in a slash pile, but there's still emissions, right? So these are all things that are going to be part of this emerging carbon market. Yeah.
Wondering if you have information on the wastewater plant and the methane gas that is burned off and how that is being recycled and possibly our community.
So I don't know much about methane, but how I know about it in regards to natural climate solutions is one of the ways to mitigate methane emissions is by neutralizing them with biochar, right? So what was starting to happen now is in some areas where there is feedstock like slash piles or farm residuals that can be turned into biochar, that is then being mixed into those landfills to basically interact with the methane and neutralize it. So it's not actually emitted. So when you do a life cycle analysis of biochar production, you actually have to go all the way to the end use and what the application is going to be. And if it's something like methane mitigation, it can really increase the carbon credits that would result from the project. So it's kind of related to the other gal's question about how we need to think about this stuff across the supply chain and across the economy.
A couple questions in the Zoom group. So Ben asked, for companies that buy credit, is there a price competition for how much they pay for credits, or are the credits sold by credit folks and that's where the competition is, not the buyer?
It's a carbon market, so it fluctuates based on what the demand is. So if you think about it, in a mandatory market where people are required to buy the credits, the demand goes way up, and theoretically the price per ton of credits would also go up. But we're not going to have mandatory markets. We're going to have a lot of voluntary markets, so that will keep the demand down and could actually have a suppressing effect on the price of the carbon. So you can go to these websites where you see the carbon credit value, and it's wobbling out there a lot right now, a lot like you're seeing with other kinds of credits and NFTs and that kind of thing. I think we're just sort of at the early stages of this and seeing how those markets are going to shake out.
And one more question
Yep.
from the Zoom crowd. Don't know their first name. If I want to use my land to grow trees and the subsurface owner wants to mine, I can't stop the mining and the destruction of my trees and surface. State law says the state will back the mining company. So what do I do?
So someone asked this question at the climate study group this morning, and they said, hey, I want to conserve my property, but someone wants to put a pipeline right away through my property. Well, those companies have a lot of power, and that's just kind of the way it is set up right now. So you could have the most powerful conservation easement on your land so that your kids can't subdivide it. But if a utility wants to use eminent domain to get a pipeline corridor through your property, they're going to probably get it. So there are limits to, I think, where this sort of property law approach can work. And those are like a whole level different change in sort of our approach to these things that we'd have to address. Are we good? Well, I love talking about this. If any of you want to follow up, have more conversations about it individually, we can talk. I'm happy. We could have coffee. I like to talk by Zoom with folks. I'll be around all year. Thank you.